Foreign policy. The crisis that began in 1982 clearly indicated that a policy of encouraging more Mexican exports and opening markets to foreign goods was essential. In the years after 1982, the government relaxed restrictions on foreign ownership of property and reduced and eliminated tariffs. The government courted foreign investments and encouraged Mexican private industry to produce goods for export. Mexico's foreign policy is still more concerned with the United States than any other country. But in recent years, Mexican leaders have asserted themselves in international forums, such as the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Maquiladora. A manufacturing zone was created in the 1960s in northern Mexico, just south of the border with the United States. Workers in this maquiladora district have produced goods primarily for consumers in the United States, and a number of U.S. companies have established plants in the zone to transform imported, duty-free components or raw materials into finished industrial products. Industrialization of the zone was promoted by the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, a treaty signed in 1995 by Mexico, the United States, and Canada that eliminated barriers to free trade among the three countries. Today, hundreds of thousands of workers are employed in the Maquiladora district, accounting for more than 20% of Mexico's entire industrial labor force. U.S. companies have been criticized for avoiding employment and environmental regulations imposed within the borders of the U.S., hiring young women for low pay, and no benefits who work in buildings that are environmentally questionable. Trade agreements. Since the mid-1980s, Mexico has entered into many free trade agreements and organizations in order to globalize its economy and pay its way out of debt. GATT WTO. In 1986, Mexico joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, a multilateral agreement that attempts to promote freer trade among countries. The World Trade Organization was created from this agreement, and Mexico has been an active member of the WTO. Under WTO agreements, Mexico has expanded the diversity of its exports beyond oil and has developed new trade relationships with countries other than the United States. NAFTA. The North American Free Trade Agreement was signed by Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Its goal is to more closely integrate the economies by eliminating tariffs and reducing restrictions so that companies can expand into all countries freely. Mexico hopes to stimulate its overall growth, enrich its big business community, and supply jobs for Mexicans in new industries. U.S. firms gain from access to inexpensive labor, raw materials, and tourism, as well as new markets to sell and invest in. Mexico runs a risk of again being overshadowed by the United States, but hopes that benefits will outweigh problems. Presidents Fox and Calderon generally supported freer flow of labor and goods between Mexico and its northern neighbors, but the issue of road transport turned into a political battle between the two countries. American truck drivers lobbied the U.S. Congress to ban Mexican trucks from crossing into the United States, claiming that these trucks are unsafe and the drivers insufficiently trained. In 2007, the Bush administration set up a pilot program to allow a limited number of Mexican trucks to enter, and Calderon's government reacted strongly when the pilot program was rescinded by the Obama administration. In 2011, an agreement that allowed Mexican trucks to cross into the United States was finally reached. Immigration policy. Unlike the agreement among member nations of the European Union, the NAFTA agreement currently does not allow free flow of labor across borders. Early in his term, Vicente Fox pushed hard to solve tensions between the United States and Mexico regarding immigration policy. Fox proposed a bold immigration initiative that included a guest worker program, amnesty for illegal immigrants, and an increase in visas issued, and movement to an eventual open border. The plan would have allowed Mexicans to work legally in the United States, while amnesty for illegal immigrants would have eventually offered a green card as well as legal citizenship to over 3 million undocumented Mexicans living in the United States. In exchange, Fox pledged to tighten the Mexican border to prevent additional illegal immigration. President George W. Bush responded positively to Fox initiatives, but the plan fell through after the September 11, 2001 attacks in the United States. President Bush reevaluated the security risks involved with Fox's plan, and the whole thing unraveled within weeks and only recently came to life again. In 2014, after Congress took no action on immigration policy, U.S. President Barack Obama announced by executive order that his administration would provide up to 4 million undocumented immigrants the ability to live and work in the U.S. without fear of deportation. However, A conservative legal campaign blocked the president's actions while judges considered their legality. The delay has held up the implementation of the plan, and it appears as if Obama will leave office before the courts rule. Another immigration issue has to do with the route that Central American migrants take through Mexico on their way to the United States. In 2014, Mexican authorities began cracking down on those following La Bestia, the Beast, a train route that goes through Mexico south to north. The plan includes replacing large stretches of track so that trains go faster, making them harder for migrants to board. Drug trafficking. Drug trafficking between Mexico and the United States has been a major problem for both countries for many years. The drug trade has spawned corruption within the Mexican government, so that officials have been often bribed to look the other way or even actively participate in the trade. The depth of drug-related problems was evident in early 2005, when the government staged a raid on its own maximum security prison, La Palma, in an effort to regain control of the prison from drug lords who had engineered the murder of a prominent fellow inmate. Fox vowed to stamp out the corruption and some major arrests were made, but the problem remained far from resolved at the end of his sexennium. When Felipe Calderón took office, he stepped up the war on drugs, sending troops and federal agents into areas where gangs control local officials. He also promised to remake the nation's police departments, root out corrupt officers, and support legislation that makes it impossible for the local police to investigate drug rings. The immediate reaction has been one of the worst waves of drug-related violence ever. The number of brutal murders, often of policemen, has increased significantly. One cause of the violence is a fierce competition between competing drug rings that want exclusive control of very lucrative smuggling routes between Mexico and the United States. Calderón reacted to these problems by turning to the army, sending thousands of troops to patrol the streets in most troubled cities. It was supposed to be an emergency measure, but the troops have remained, and some have criticized them for brutality against ordinary citizens. In May 2008, the violence reached a fevered pitch after Mexico's police chief was gunned down as he arrived home late at night. Other top officials have also been assassinated, including the police second-in-command in the border town of Juarez and a top policeman from Mexico City. This targeting of senior law enforcement officials is unprecedented in Mexican history. U.S. President Bush pushed for government assistance to Mexico to fight the drug wars, but the funding became bogged down in the U.S. Congress. On a visit to Mexico in early 2009, U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton frankly admitted that America's insatiable demand for illegal drugs fuels the drug trade, and that our inability to prevent weapons from being illegally smuggled across the border to arm these criminals causes the deaths of police officers, soldiers, and civilians in Mexico. She promised Black Hawk helicopters for the Mexican police, but funding for them was cut by the U.S. Congress. By 2011, the U.S. widened its role by sending new CIA operatives and retired military personnel to a military base in Mexico, where security officials from both countries work side by side in collecting information about drug cartels and helping plan operations. In another operation, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration and a Mexican counter-narcotics police unit collaborated on an operation that led to the arrest of a prominent drug trafficker. However, in 2010, the murder rate in Mexico was 17 per 100,000 people, up more than two-thirds from 2007. The fighting was concentrated in a few areas, most notably in Ciudad Juarez, a center of maquila factories just across the border from El Paso, Texas. There, the murder rate has climbed to one of the highest in the world as two cartels battle for control of the border crossing. Since 2010, many drug lords have been killed or arrested, and in 2012, the national murder rate fell for the first time since 2008. President Peña Nieto vowed to reduce it by half during his 6-year tenure. After taking office in December 2012, President Peña Nieto moved to end the widespread access that U.S. security agencies had in Mexico to tackle the violence that affects both sides of the border. Since then, U.S. law enforcement has had to go through Mexico's Federal Interior Ministry, the agency that controls security and domestic policy. Despite these efforts, a tragedy occurred in 2014 with the disappearance of 43 students in the southwestern state of Guerrero. The Mexican Attorney General's office held the students had been handed over by local police to a drug gang, which killed them, apparently because they believed the students were members of a rival gang. The government's report was disputed, and as of late 2015, the murders were still under investigation. Ethnic rebellions. In his first year in office, Fox made several efforts to negotiate with the Zapatistas to settle their dispute with the government. The EZLN, the Zapatista National Liberation Front, began in 1994 in the southern state of Chiapas in protest to the signing of the NAFTA Treaty. Zapatistas saw the agreement as a continuation of the exploitation of voracious landowners and corrupt PRI bosses. Their army captured 4 towns, including the popular tourist destination, and they demanded jobs, land, housing, food, health, education, independence, freedom, democracy, justice, and peace. Their rebellion spread, and Zapatista supporters wore black ski masks to hide their identity from the government. Today the rebellion is technically still on, but has quieted down considerably. The Zapatista rebellion was based on ethnicity, the Amerindian disaffection for the mestizo, urban-based government. It has since spread to other areas and ethnicities, and it represents a major threat to Mexico's political stability. The 2006 uprising in Oaxaca is another indication that hostilities toward the rich and the government are still quite strong in the South, particularly toward PRI leaders. Democracy and electoral reform. Part of the answer to Mexico's economic and foreign policy woes lies in the development of democratic traditions within the political system. Mexico's tradition of authoritarianism works against democratization, but modernization of the economy, the political value of populism, and the democratic revolutionary impulses work for it. One of the most important indications of democracy is the development of competitive, clean elections in many parts of the country. The Mexican political system went through a series of reforms during the 1990s that solidly directed the country toward democracy. The IFE, Instituto Federal Electoral, was created as an independent regulatory body to safeguard honest and accurate election results. Although it was dominated by PRI in its early years, in recent elections it appears to be operating as it should. Some election reforms include campaign finance restrictions, laws that limit contributions to campaigns, critical media coverage as media is less under PRI control, international watch teams as Mexico has tried to convince other countries that elections are fair and competitive, election monitoring by opposition party members. The 1994 campaign for the presidency got off to a very bad start when PRI candidate Luis Donaldo Colosio was assassinated in Tijuana. PRI quickly replaced him with Ernesto Zedillo, but the old specters of violence and chaos threatened the political order. The incumbent president's brother was implicated in the assassination, and high officials were linked to drug trafficking. Despite the trouble, Zedillo stepped up to the challenge, and PRI won the election handily. Many observers believe that the election of 1994 and 2000 have been the most competitive, fair elections in Mexico's history. The election of 2000 broke all precedents when a PAN candidate, Vicente Fox, won the presidency, finally displacing the 70-year dominance of PRI. The controversial election of 2006 was clearly competitive, but it also threatened to tear the fragile base of democracy apart. Obrador questioned the very legitimacy of the process, and the strong support he received from his followers is evidence that instability is still a part of the Mexican political system. However, the fact that the election tribunal followed the process set by law is a step toward becoming a liberal democracy. Members of Obrador's own party, the PRD, eventually came to criticize him for his behavior. Even more significant is the eventual acceptance by most Mexican citizens of its decisions, evidence that the country successfully passed through the crisis. During the 2013 state and local election campaigns, violence broke out that resulted in the death of 6 candidates, with another wounded and numerous assaults of family members and party and campaign officials. The violence was an embarrassment for Peña Nieto's new government, and opposition leaders called on the president to put the army in the streets in some states to protect voting procedures and voters. Most of the killings took place in small towns, which are less protected and more vulnerable to actions by drug and organized crime groups. Whereas the motives for the killings are murky, they continue Mexico's tradition of violence associated with political campaigns. In his first full day of office in December 2012, President Peña Nieto unveiled a Pact for Mexico of 95 loosely defined proposals, signed by the leaders of all 3 main parties. Although many political leaders, particularly PRD officials, opposed the president, he expressed the hope that all parties could work together to solve Mexico's problems. Peña Nieto's cabinet consists of PRI technocrats and party stalwarts, but also include PAN-party finance officials and one former leader of PRD. These moves indicate that Mexico is maintaining its competitive party system, despite PRI's return to the presidency. What will the future bring? Will Mexico be able to sustain a strong, stable economy? Has the political system fully emerged from its peasant-based patron-client system and authoritarianism as a modern democracy? Will more social equality be granted to peasants and city workers? Many observers await the answers to these questions, including people in less developed countries that look to Mexico as an example for development. More powerful countries, particularly the United States, realize that international global politics and economies are tied to the successes of countries like Mexico. Despite the instabilities of the past, Mexico does have strong traditions, a well-developed sense of national pride, and many natural resources, and a record of progress, no matter how uneven.